Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pathways to Breaking the Cycle. I am your host, Kimberly Apodaca, and today we are going to be talking about Inside the Bars, Uncovering Prison Corruption. And I am so excited to have Courtney Montoya with us today. Hi, Courtney.
Hey, Kimberly. Thank you for having me.
Oh, gosh, I'm so excited to have you here tonight and to share with us. Would you just share a little bit about what organizations you belong to, what you do, your involvement in the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am involved with Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, as well as the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, both in New Mexico and nationally. And I organize with People Behind the Walls nationally through the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. The Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee is a union comprised, it is part of the IWW labor union, and it is made up of incarcerated members who make up the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, and they organize surrounding conditions in prisons and jails throughout the United States. They organize prison strikes, organize for systemic abuses that they encounter, and it is a national organization, but we also have a local branch in New Mexico that is part and parcel with Millions for Prisoners New Mexico. With Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, we organize around the human rights of people who are incarcerated that are our loved ones, community members, family members, and all of the members in Millions for Prisoners of New Mexico are system impacted or have children, family, or community, or like myself, just seeing my community be incarcerated away into prisons and jails in the 90s, the mid-90s, early 90s, and the 2000s. I also had family who dealt with incarceration as well. And I also organize with Albuquerque Mutual Aid, helping community on the ground and being in solidarity with community who are experiencing being unhoused or just needing to get by. And I also, my day job is with the ACLU of New Mexico as a community engagement specialist, working on policy surrounding the criminal legal system as well as reproductive rights.
Courtney, you're so inspiring. You really are. You're just always in there in every area. You're always advocating for either the people behind the walls, our people, our homeless community, just all around. You're just always in the mix with everything, and I just think it's so amazing and it's so inspiring. I know that you worked in the penitentiary of New Mexico about a decade ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the experience that I had working at the penitentiary of New Mexico led to my journey of where I am today and the advocacy that I do today, because People Behind the Walls are still there. The penitentiary of New Mexico is a supermax prison, and it has a supermax prison, but it was made into a supermax after the prison riot that happened on February 1st, 1980. And what led to the riot were conditions. So there were people were overcrowded within the housing units that they had. They had people in bunks, and people were overcrowded such that people were sleeping on the floor. And in addition to overcrowding, there was a culture of abuse. There was a culture of people being retaliated against, and there was a culture of the correctional officers using, pushing people down the stairs. And also there was a culture of a snitch ward that was set up in the facility, where they brandished people as being snitches, which is a death sentence. So they had people in confinement in cells within a snitch ward. Not everyone was there for that, the reason of being a snitch, quote unquote. Some people were there under more of a protective custody type of situation. Mm-hmm. Well, when the riot unfolded, 33 inmates died. Everyone involved was traumatized, including COs, staff, everyone there. And in the 90s, they ended up building the level 5 and the level 6 facility where people were exported into those cells. So backtrack to my journey. I was suffering from addiction. I had a very hard life. And, life is really hard for people coming up in this world under capitalism. And so I decided to get myself up out of it, went to the University of New Mexico, got a biology degree. My intentions was to work with wildlife. And I did have a side job as a student librarian at UNM. And at CNM back when it was TVI. So I had worked in libraries. I loved libraries. I loved getting lost in books. So consequentially, I had actually read a book about the prison riot and was really fascinated with what would cause something so brutal to happen. What conditions would cause such brutality? Like someone was beheaded, like horrible things happened to people. And of course, a family member who was actually a family friend, not related by blood, had somebody lost to that, my grandmother's friend, who was a young person who ended up getting brutally murdered. So I was curious, and after I graduated, I put in a bunch of job applications, and one of them was an animal shelter. The other one was at the Sandia base, doing research on animals, but I think it was more cleaning type of stuff. And then the Penitentiary of New Mexico came up. I got a call, and because I had applied with the state, and I saw PNM, and I thought it was the power company, but then I discovered it was the prison. I went in for a tour, and was expecting being a librarian for people in solitary confinement to be kind of like Shawshank Redemption, where you go in and you have a cart full of books and you're visiting a few cells. Little did I realize that there were 600 cells with people who were on solitary confinement.
That many people?
Yes, and they had one facility. It's a big super facility, so you drive through it. There's a level 2, so I was also the librarian at the level 2, which is actually kind of like Gen Pop. They do have people separated off into halves, but people can freely roam. People can visit the library physically. There are jobs that people can do and interact, so it's not on lockdown. It's more of a bunk situation where they're in beds. Then there's a level 6, which was classified as a supermax, and then a level 5, which was classified as the max. So the people in the supermax, there's 300 cells on that side and 300 cells on the level 5, and then there's about a capacity for 200 people at the level 2. So I went in and they let me see a pod. And I did the interview, and the interview was actually, it made me feel like this is where I need to be, because the level 6, there is a library, but people who are incarcerated can't access it or couldn't access it physically. They couldn't walk in, so we would deliver the books to them. So it was a lot of manual labor, carrying and transporting books and carting them around this giant facility, going up and down stairs, because of the way they're tiered out. But, you know, I got to see what a pod looked like, and I just knew that it was the place I needed to be at. The interview questions were all about how will you, basically acknowledge somebody's humanity, and how, like this is a service that's needed. Why is it important for us to invest in education of people who are incarcerated? And, you know, what about children, you know, like kind of interview questions that really nourished my soul to think and actually speak from my heart. So, you know, I ended up taking the job, and what it taught me was I was very kind of shy and, you know, what have you, but the people there, the interests that they have, even on lockdown, you know, people have interests that they want to envision the world after even if they're never going to get out. They're like, I want to study physics. I want to study the universe. Like, so I tried to bring books to nourish their souls and nourish their heart. And it nourished me, and it caused me to change as a human being. It caused me to develop this like deep compassion for other beings, like other humans, you know, because I had worked in animal shelters and stuff, trying to get into like veterinary sciences or animal sciences, and seeing how harmful it is to see animals in cages, but seeing human beings in cages. And some of them were young, and some of them weren't. Some of them were really elderly. And seeing that on that level changed my trajectory forever. And that's what brings me to where I am today.
Wow. What was your experience like emotionally? Like seeing these people, I mean, like you said, you know, it's hard for you to see an animal caged up and then to see a human being caged up. Like what was that like for you emotionally?
Oh, it took everything out of my heart and soul. Like I would go home, because I lived in Albuquerque and I would drive to Santa Fe every day. And I would think about the conversations I had with people, and I would see people self-harming, you know, like in any way that they could. Young guys too, you know, they were in their 20s. I was younger too, you know, I was in my early 30s.
Yeah.
But seeing people, and it's not just they're locked up, like they're pacing back and forth in the cell. They're kicking the door, like everything. The interactions that you have with them often are them putting their face through this tiny little slot called a food port. And all you see is their eyes, you know, looking up at you with this despair. People screaming, like, you know, it's awful. You see people with like, or I would see people that had severe mental health issues that the solitary confinement would make worse. Like there was one guy that was a skeleton. Like he was wearing his prison uniform, but you could see his spine popping out of his back.
Gosh.
And he was hearing voices. He thought that there were people in the sink, like talking to him through the sink. He was like missing patches of hair, you know.
Courtney, are these issues, these mental issues, are these something that they already had? Is this something that is developed being there in that facility, in that type of environment?
Oh, both. You know, like some people, incarceration is used to house people who have severe mental health issues, and also those issues develop over time. If someone's been in solitary confinement for, you know, years, which is often the case, you don't see sunlight. You're locked in a box. It's concrete. It's cold in the winter and really hot in the summer. Like the air conditioning or the heating is never working.
Right. My son talks about that a lot.
Yeah,
He always says, it's
awful.
freezing in here, Mom. It's so cold.
One thing that I noticed too, and medical staff, I would try to corroborate this with them, is severe vitamin D deficiencies,
Right.
which also causes mental health effects.
Yes.
and physical effects. Like there were elderly people that I would go to give them their magazines and they couldn't hold the pen. They were shaking. They couldn't sign it. And then the COs would be like, well, slam the door on them and you can't give them their books or magazines. And then hearing them cry, this specific instance, cry out screaming, that it's like that's all they had. Is their 3 books a week or magazines a week or
That's
whatever.
what they had to look forward to.
Yeah. And so it emotionally, it eviscerated me to see that. And I didn't know what to do or how to process what was going on. I just went day to day and tried to bring a little bit of light and joy into as many people's lives as I could. I didn't have a lot of time to converse between them because they didn't want us to become too familiar with anyone.
Right.
People couldn't call me by first name because they had this weird dichotomy of how women should interact. It was really weird. Everything was gendered and weird. But it harmed me significantly. And always having a radio on you, even if you're not in a pod seeing something bad happen to somebody, you're always hearing it throughout the facility. It's like, so when I got out, I found myself addicted to violence and self-harm. I didn't do violence on others, but I was putting myself in situations where harm could come to me because it was like that self-harm was really overtaking me.
Right.
And I feel that people who work in those environments and especially if you're a CO and you're cracking down on people and giving the physical or emotional or psychological abuse, you don't really see the full breadth of that trauma until you're not there anymore, and then everything starts to flood into you. When I left, it was like I was born again. Like I spent a lot of time crying, curled up in a ball in the shower, just with the water pouring on me, and just tears would never stop coming. And I was like, one day I am going to find a way to express this and talk about what I saw. And there's no justice in it.
Right.
There's just absolutely no justice in what's going on.
What is the treatment like from the correctional officers towards these people, our people, that are living in these types of conditions?
Oh, awful. If someone harms themselves, they joke about it. I've seen toilet paper withheld as a joke, and you see like young officers come in with not even the intention of actually really being a corrections officer. They want to use it as like a way to get a different job and go do something else.
Right.
But then they're demoralized by the fact that it's like you see a lot of, Chicano people at the facility I was at, mm-hmm. oppressing fellow Chicano people. They're from the same hoods. They're from the same communities. And, it's giving beat downs, pepper spraying people. I saw a guy, he was getting surgery from a self-harm wound, and he was a 20-some-year-old. He's like 22. Oh my gosh. And when I was taking, the training and stuff, they were joking around about how funny it was that there was this young guy that kept reopening his wounds and on his wrist, and I think it was the same person they were talking about, but I went to go give him magazines, and he had just woken up off of surgery of getting his arm repaired, and he was putting his shirt on, and he was in a cell, and that's where it took place, and he had this IV bag and stuff, and he was pushing it along, and he was on a slab of concrete, that's like where they were, and it's like conditions that you don't you don't realize until you see. Like, everything is concrete. The torture, the abuse, and the COs, they come home to that into their communities. They treat people with inhumanity beyond inhumanity. And with, like, these are internationally, the U.S. is internationally known for its incarceration rates, its reliance on incarceration, pulling people up into the system. And we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, but we only make up 5% of the population. And that goes across all, classes of people, whether it be people that are black and brown, whether it be people that are trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, whether it be, women, people across the board in the United States in our system are brutalized, and then nothing is done to repair. And they treat that as though that's justice for whatever harm. Let's say that, and there's so many people that are wrongfully convicted.
Right.
But let's say that somebody did do something that was harm to another person. That doesn't fix it. And that's something I contended with when my best friend, and I'd already been doing this work for a while, my best friend got shot by a mass shooter here in Albuquerque at his workplace. And then the person went to the edge of the city and shot himself. And my friend survived. I was in the ICU with him. And then a few years later, he ended up moving away to Arizona, and then he was killed and murdered. And I saw the article come out about it, and I'm not trying to hold myself to any standard above any other person, because I think that our pain is real.
Right.
But I didn't find any healing in the fact that the person is going through the punishment system, because I don't know what's going on in the person's life. And brutalizing another human being, locking a person away into a cell, and advocating for that as a way of your own healing through trauma just isn't it,
No, it absolutely isn't. I was talking with one of the moms from my Stronger Together, Never Alone support group, and I was telling her, people far too often, and again, I didn't lose a son. My son is doing a 10-year sentence in the Department of Corrections in Hobbs. However, I will say that just me as a human being, I'm for restoration, not revenge. Mm-hmm. And I think that people, if they realized, instead of operating in that type of energy of just wanting to be vengeful all the time, revenge, or, bring back the death penalty, for instance, that doesn't solve anything. Like, people don't realize that what our people are needing is healing, and they go into these facilities and they get treated inhumane. Mm-hmm. And then they expect them to come out and be, a successful citizen of the community. Mm-hmm. What did you see as far as, like, were there any COs that had any kind of empathy towards our people behind the walls? Did you ever see that at all?
Yeah, I did. There are people that really truly believe that what they're doing is restoration. Mm-hmm. They really truly believe in the system. There were people that were incredibly kind to me when I was working there. And there were people that were incredibly not kind to me. Like, I went through hell. But, there were people that, they joked around with the guys. But you could see the grief in their eyes, because it's like you have the guys basically at the level 6. They go out to the yard in the morning for an hour. So they have sometimes up to a 2-man escort, or maybe 3 if it's a really big guy, physically, like a very tall, large person. Maybe they'll have 3 people. bring them outside for an hour into a cage that's on nothing but concrete. Like, there's not a plant in sight, you know? Chaplains would get punished for bringing in a flower, you know? Like,
Are you serious?
the way that they did the church services, they would bring them in. There was an adjacent part of the library that was cells where they could study and stuff for like testing. And the library was an old chapel, which was like, it was just creepy. But like, so they would bring them in. The chaplain would come in, and they would all be lined up in cells, and then they would give them their communion through the food port. You know, the person's like coming down to receive their communion through the food port. Like, there has been nothing more haunting than the reminders of those things. Like, just everything done through a little slot. Like somebody having to kneel down, put their hands into the food port behind them, get cuffed up, stand up, go to the shower, get cuffed back out, you know, or going to the yard, being escorted there, then going into a strip cage, having to strip completely naked, you know, having to do a full cavity, everything, cough 2 times, this and that, dehumanizing people at every single step of the way.
And is this just like a daily thing?
Every day, every day. That's how they did it. I don't know what they're doing now. They will say whatever they have to say to make the system seem like it is benevolent, but it's not. It's the same facility. I don't know what their routine is, but that was every day for people at the level 6. Now, the people at the level 5 would get some tier time where they would be out on a tier with, you know, other people that were in that pod. But yeah, it's still a large degree of confinement. And even if they've reduced it from 23 hours a day to 20 hours a day, it's the majority of your time is spent in a box in concrete. And the officers would make brevity and make light of it. And sometimes they would joke around with the guys or whatever. But, you know, you have to be ready if you're a correctional officer to go from that to serving a beatdown or pepper spraying someone or, you know, getting a 6-man team in to restrain someone. It is repression, you know, and so there's no way to paint that in a good light. They might feel like sometimes they're joking around and sometimes there's those moments of, you know, someone has a smile on their face, but they're doling out repression every moment. So, yeah, I mean, they could be joking one moment and then the next moment they could be all in on that person, attacking them, and just taking someone's liberties to the point to where they're confined in a box. There's never going to be a way of explaining away how that is justice.
Right, right. What is... were you ever told, like in the process of you applying for this position, and were you ever told not to be kind to the people? Were you ever told, like, don't smile at them, don't make eye contact with them, don't treat them like human beings? Like, are you told that in the process when you apply to work in a facility like that?
Not by the department that I worked for, because it was education and they were all really... They were still human. Right. But, you know, as far as it goes with the corrections staff and the administration that are in charge of being, you know, the COs, the administrators, the wardens, etc., absolutely. Like, do not show them too much, because the narrative is they're going to take advantage of you and have you break them out of the prison, you know? Like, that's what their excuse is for everything. So and especially if you're a woman, and this is why I ultimately was not able to be in that environment at all. It was just as much for my safety. And it wasn't the people who were incarcerated, they showed me a lot of respect, and they didn't try anything, but they always frame it to be that you you have to watch your back. You have to constantly watch out that you might get stabbed. Like, they would come up behind me and be like, I could have stabbed you and you wouldn't have even known. And it's like, why are you hyping me up like this, you know? And then also, they, like, don't smile. It was all about, like, don't, like, just because of the fact that I was a woman too.
Right.
It was huge. Like, they were constantly telling me that, like, if I were to talk to somebody for too long or let them in too much, that I could get sexually assaulted. But really, they were just trying to make it so that there wasn't that human connection, you know? And I wasn't buying it. Like, I really, really connected with a lot of people in terms of their brilliance. Like, people were brilliant. They had so many thoughts and ideas about the world and the universe. These are human beings. Like, it's not, yeah. And I have run into people after they've released on the streets just randomly, you know, like at the grocery store or thrift store or what have you. I've had some instances, and it's just being on the other side to where the person's not behind a wall. It's an interesting dynamic. And I remember one time when a young guy, tattoo artist, really great artist, really cool guy, in terms of his visions for, you know, who he wanted to be, who he wanted to become. Because, you know, as Brian Stevenson says, no one is the worst thing that they've ever done.
Right.
We have so much more than that. And often some of the bad things that happen are the things that lead to crime, are because of the root causes in our society aren't addressed, like housing, access to quality education, food, you know, enrichment in life. Like, I learned from being around those people who were incarcerated at the penitentiary of New Mexico, that human ingenuity is being neglected. Like, what if we were to treat people like people and let people achieve the dreams that they have from when they're a child and have all the resources that they need to build that? What would society look like in that instance? Like, we might be neglecting and we might be withholding society from great achievements. You know, somebody could have the cure for cancer in their brain, but they just aren't able to use that part of their brain to nourish that part of their brain because they're dealing with survival on the streets, you know,
Right.
addiction. And a lot of the times addiction is because we're trying to ease the pain of the trauma that we've had
Yes.
because of conditions that we live in. You
Yes.
know, the majority of the people are poor globally. So if we address those root causes of poverty, housing, etc., and give people a chance, we could definitely live in a better world and have other ways of dealing with how we harm each other, because we all harm each other in some way,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and not always, but each of us has caused harm. We're not pure beings at all times. Like, and sometimes it's unintentional that we hurt each other, and sometimes it's intentional, but moving past carcerality as the mode of justice and of fixing it, it hasn't fixed anything so far. So,
Right.
you know, it's just making things more difficult.
Right. I know there have been times where I've been on the phone with Josiah, and the correctional officers will be in the pod yelling and just being so demeaning and degrading. And I told Josiah, do you have to deal with that, like, all the time? And he's like, Mom, that's like normal here. That's what we deal with every day, all day long. You know, there was one time Josiah was walking to the library to get a book, and he happened to see one of the lieutenants, and he stopped to talk to the lieutenant because he was trying to get transferred to a different cell. And the lieutenant said, well, you know, here's this paper, go have the CO in your pod sign it and then bring it back to me. Well, Josiah takes the paper, and the CEO said, I didn't tell you that you could go see the lieutenant. You were supposed to go to the library. And he said, I did go to the library, but I saw the lieutenant on the way. She's like, well, now you're not going back because that's not where you told me you were going. So it's like they make everything difficult for them all the time. Mm-hmm. There's always just some type of issue in some way. It's like they could never just treat them like a human being and just be like, okay, let me sign this for you, take it back, to make things, to smooth over, to make things go a little bit smoother. They always have to kick up dust for something.
Yeah.
And I don't understand it. I just really don't understand it.
And I feel like when you're in that position of power over somebody's life,
right,
that I feel triggers a certain part of one's brain to
right,
become addicted to that power and to want to enforce that on everyone that you encounter, whereas when you're talking about young people and developing minds and developing brains, and lack of nourishment of one's brain, and one's just trying to survive and trying to get past this so that, they can be back into their communities, it is that, an expression of that power trip that they have over other people's lives. And studies have shown that CEOs, police, people who are in law enforcement, carry that home with them into their communities. And where are the repercussions for the abuses that happen to the people who are inside?
Right.
They have a free ticket to abuse and even murder in some cases, with Vicente Villela, who died at MDC in 2019, who was killed in the same kind of hold that George Floyd was killed in. And when Sam Bregman, his attorney, defended him, it just became clear when we were watching the proceedings, Millions for Prisoners came to stand with the family. Of course, his partner, Lupe, was 9 months pregnant when it happened. And so, it became apparent that the system is designed to give them that free ride. And if you look on the national scope of things, what message does it send that President Trump wants to pardon Derek Chauvin, the person that killed George Floyd? It's rampant, and I mean, not to mention the white supremacy culture that's
right,
very inherent within the prison industrial complex. One thing that I can say that I really wanted to talk about is that the conditions in New Mexico, what led me to see that it's not just New Mexico, it's a pattern of abuse all throughout the United States. One really, really awful thing that has been taking place in Red Onion State Prison, which is also a supermax, is that, and it's located in Virginia, in the west, and part of Virginia, and people have been self-immolating to get out of the conditions of solitary confinement in that facility. They've been setting themselves on fire to get out. And to think of how bad are the conditions when people are, and it's based on the racism that they're encountering and how that's all flooding into their treatment within the facility. That's kind of what we're seeing, is that the conditions of confinement are really awful. We're also seeing that private prison stocks are skyrocketing
right,
under the new administration and more of us are becoming criminalized. Poverty itself is criminalized. It's not just, it was this thing with the war on drugs in the 90s and the early 2000s and people got marched off and in the 80s, of course, the Reagan administration. It wasn't just that. With the Grants Pass versus Johnson case that happened, where the Supreme Court basically stated that it is not an abuse of power to one's civil liberties, and it is not an Eighth Amendment violation of someone's Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment to sweep unhoused people and to take their possessions and to make it so that they cannot exist in society, so that they can't visibly exist in society, so it's no coincidence that more of our communities are being criminalized. Right now, we're dealing in New Mexico with a lot of extremely harmful legislation surrounding reforming the youth code to criminalize young people at unprecedented levels, and then also spilling into, just the civil commitment piece with the governor holding a special session,
Right.
and then, recent legislation that is moving through the legislature regarding civil commitment of people, and also just the criminal justice system being so embedded in our lives, and seeing the murders that happen whenever the police are involved in, dealing with the ever-growing epidemic of people being unhoused because life isn't affordable, because people deserve more and need more, and we deserve to have a society and live in a society that nourishes us, because we're worth so much more than what we're given, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the abuse of power that happens behind the walls. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah.
In whatever aspect that is.
Yeah. So I feel like with granting a level of power over somebody's every facet of life, from you're getting your food passed through you through the food port, you have to get, you get your food from COs, you get your rec from COs, your shower, all of that, everything, they have control and power over every aspect of a person's life. And with that comes abuses of power. It's very systemic throughout prisons all over the place, throughout the country, for abuses of power to occur. One very important recent example that is taking place right now and is kind of still underway is the prison strike of COs in New York, who went on strike because Robert Brooks was murdered by COs, and the records were unsealed, and the COs launched a strike to ask that the Solitary Confinement Halt Act in New York be stopped so that they could rely on solitary confinement. So basically, they are not being granted the power to have somebody locked in a cell for most of their waking hours. And so they did a work stoppage to basically, people weren't getting food. People weren't getting, because they have control over every aspect of one's life, medications, food, you get your laundry from them. And so they basically went on strike, and the National Guard had to come in. And I saw Instagram live videos of the National Guard, saying, wow, these are really awful conditions,
From the National Guard.
Yeah.
Hey.
So it's, there are so many countless instances of abuses of power that happen nationally. I'm sure people behind the walls, I talk to a lot of people behind the walls, because a lot of the work I do is just as a media person for IWOC. I just transmit information that's going on. Sometimes I have things to add in about the other scope of things that's taking place, nationally or what have you. But people will constantly have instances of abuse of power, repression. If people are trying to get the word out about conditions that are going on, that's the biggest instance of abuse and power, that's taking place. Like the TDCJ in Texas have a good friend named Comrade Z, who has repeatedly been put into solitary confinement. And just for spreading the word about the conditions that are taking place. A friend, Nate Lindell, who is in Wisconsin prison, who is, currently facing repression for having his name lifted by others who are advocating for him about the conditions of confinement, and they're basically putting him on lockdown and writing him up for it. So it's like countless instances of when people have power over everything in someone's life, and it goes to the level of every level of the administration, because it's a hierarchy,
Right.
you know?
Right. I remember seeing a few months ago, and let's see if you can remember, because I don't remember what prison this was, but I remember seeing on Instagram, and it was all over the news too, those correctional officers that were beating that man in it. What it kind of looked like, maybe like a medical office. Do you remember that a few months ago? There was probably, I would say, a handful of correctional officers, and they all took turns just hitting them and just hitting him on the head, kicking him, throwing him. I mean, just the most highest form of abuse that you could think of. And I just thought to myself, like, what gives these people the right to abuse our people like that behind the walls?
Yeah. And I think it was at the intake facility at RDC. And there was also actually one thing that's been going on for years, has been in California Department of Corrections. I think it's called CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and something. But there have been gladiator fights.
Oh, I saw that.
And it actually also happened here. So here it was, or it was actually, I'm sorry, it was in LA County, where 30 probation officers were indicted on criminal charges for hosting gladiator fights at the Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall. So that happened in LA, but in CDCR, it's happening in the adult prisons too. They also have something similar in Louisiana, or they did, where they would have people do gladiator fights and then people would pay to watch it.
Right.
So the power trip goes deep. And like, I always come back to think about what folks are bringing into the community. If they're hosting gladiator fights as COs, they have this power trip over people. They bring that home into their families and their communities, and no repercussions,
Right.
Well,
we just had that happen in Los Lunas, and we're going to put a small clip of that because I did find it on YouTube, and it shows the correctional officers setting up an inmate to get beat up by other people. And it's horrifying. I was just flabbergasted. I couldn't even believe it. I was like, they really just intentionally like stand there and watch people get beat up and think it's just like entertainment. Mm-hmm. It's just so, it's disturbing. It's so disturbing.
Yeah.
Because then I think about, my son, who is living in these conditions and still has 6 more years behind the walls. And I think to myself, what is my kid going to face? What is he going to have to endure? What type of survival skills is he going to have to implement to get through this next 6 years of his life? Am I going to get back my child that went in there and I'm not? I mean, of course, my kid's going to have a good family support system, and we're going to do anything and everything we can to make sure that he's successful when he comes out. But I'm doing that even now that he's in there. I try to give him as much normalcy as I can. You know, whether that's constantly putting money on his tablet so he could watch movies, so he could play games, you know, just so he could keep his mind just on something else other than just surviving constantly every day. I mean, he finally got into the welding program there. He was on the wait list for 8 months, and he finally got into that. So that's been really good. But even with that, the classes are every other week, twice a week, every other week. You know, it's like,
It's not enough.
no, because they, you know, sometimes he'll call and he'll say, I'll say, how are you doing today? I'm bored, Mom. I'm bored. I'm tired of this place. I'm bored. I said, well, go outside and get some sun. They're not letting us go outside today. You know, so you're right. What you say, you know, they have power over every move they make. Every move they make.
Yeah.
They have power over it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, often what's not discussed is the impact that it has on families, the impact that it has on communities, what mothers have to do and spend in terms of their resources, of their hearts, and, you know, their minds, and everything that goes into, like, caring for your child, but you can't see them regularly, if at all, you know. And
Well, I drive 5.5 hours to go see Josiah, and I get to see him for 2 hours.
Yeah, and it's just not enough. Like, it's never enough. And thinking about how do you heal something like that?
Right.
And yeah, that's what I worry about, is the repercussions on our communities. And, you know, thinking about it, it causes generational trauma.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely.
So, and it carries on, and it will carry on and carry on. And when do we stop? You know, when do we decide that this isn't what we want to do anymore? We want to do something that is restorative and that does see the whole person instead of just a fragment of the person. And really, through this work, I believe that it's going to take all of us, especially people that are most proximal to the issue and that have experienced the issue and that have stakes in the game, to come up with a new world, you know, literally. Like, so much is going on. So many of us are just sick of it. And so many of us are criminalized or part of a criminalized class, or we know somebody who is. And instead of criminalization, I want to see healing. Instead of harmful rhetoric that people will often, you know, I just try not to look at the comments.
Right.
But whenever there's like a sweep of like unhoused folks, everyone that you have ever known in your life comes out and they have a hot take about how the state's doing not enough to brutalize and repress people. And I just don't understand that. Like, where does the heart come into it? Like, why aren't we grieving that we live in a world with such disparity?
Right.
You know, and I feel like a lot of the times when people are, you know, talking shit about people who are either incarcerated or who are unhoused or who are, you know, have a history of using substances, there's this fear of, I don't want to be that, you know, and I feel like that's maybe what it is, but I'm not really sure. It's like you're so afraid of being in that position that, you know, you're just going to hate on it. And I just don't really know. Or maybe, I don't know why people do that, but I try to just not look, or sometimes I try to educate if I can, or say my perspective. And not to say that I'm any smarter or better than anyone,
Right.
but it's like, I feel like if you lead like through the heart and really feel for others, you know, that it's not always what the narrative is that the police are saying or that the news is saying. Like, for example, when Brett Rosenaw, a young 15-year-old kid, was murdered by police and in a burning house, the media narrative came out to criminalize the young person, like, instead of trying to humanize the person.
Right.
And I feel like humanization, I think that might be some of the answer.
Right. There's something that I posted on my Instagram, and I pinned it as my first photo when you go into my Instagram for Pathways to Breaking the Cycle. And it's by Malcolm X, and it says, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people being oppressed and loving those doing the oppressing." And I find that to be 110% true. Because when my son turned himself in, the next day, the Albuquerque Journal printed something that said Josiah Apodaca was arrested and he's a cold-blooded killer, when he wasn't even the one who shot the gun. He wasn't even in the same area, And I call his lawyer immediately, and I'm like, "Oh my God, the Journal, this is what they posted about Josiah." She said, "Kim, stay off social media. Don't watch the news. Don't look at the newspapers, because it's going to drive you crazy." And I'm like, "Well, is there anything we could do? That's like assassination of character."
Yeah.
And she said, "All I can tell you is stay away from it." And I did. After that, I did.
Yeah.
I stayed away from all of it, because they just lie and lie. And here they feed our community all this stuff, all this content that doesn't even have, sometimes it's not even 50% truth,
Yeah, and it's often state-sponsored media too, whether it be like the city coming out and praising the sweeps and saying how wonderful they are, or whether it be the state-sponsored media that's from, the federal level, that's pushing the narrative of whoever the president is at the time. It's made to push a narrative. That's why I feel like media that is made by the people is extremely important. So I feel like this broadcast, like the work that you're doing, the work that people submit from behind the walls and from the streets, like people lifting voices that aren't the static that's made to keep us repressed and keep us under control. I feel like that is the value, is that we all have gifts to offer this world. And for some of us, it's using our voice, and for some of us, it's being a channel for others to use our voice. And for some of us, it can be a lot of things. And I feel like, especially now, there's mutual aid networks, there's networks of providing independent media that's not the state-sponsored media, and there's just a lot of ways that we can give, and there's a lot of ways that we can support one another and try to make it through this. And yeah,
let's talk a little bit about the prison health care and the neglect and corruption of that, and meeting the medical needs of our people behind the walls.
Yeah, it's absolutely egregious. The medical neglect and abuse. It's getting access to medical care is non-existent. Medical professionals that work within the system will have to fight to get treatment because it costs too much.
Right.
A lot of the times, private medical, corporations or private medical systems are used in a lot of prisons throughout the United States. And the abuse, the neglect, the lack of care, and just even mental health staff, medical staff, like, people look at people behind the walls as under a lens of, they just look at them through a lens of negativity. And, there are good people that are doing that work, of course. But I feel like a lot of the times they're afraid I have anonymously spoken to a doctor from California who was lifting medical conditions that were taking place there about maybe a year and a half ago. But you kind of lose contact with folks that are willing to say their piece about what's going on because of fear of retaliation on themselves. Like, as for me, I've talked about my experience on various platforms.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I don't even care, like, at this point, it's just like I've made my decision. But to say something because I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't. And it's not to say that I'm any morally higher or lower than anyone else. It's just, I just can't. I can't deal with the nightmares. Like with the young person that I was talking about that was on a slab getting surgery to repair, he had reopened his wound when we were out doing deliveries of books. And they were threatening to pepper spray him, and they had him put his hands behind his back and kneel down and put his hands through the food court port to handcuff him. And that's like where his injury was, just the lack of quality food, like people are fed substandard food and not in good amounts. Like they aren't given supplements to like supplement how bad the diet is. Like physiologically it's hell, if somebody has enough money to get commissary, it's a bunch of junk,
Right.
It's in terms of getting, medical care. Just referring back to the Red Onion State Prison, one person, they had testimony of how they set themselves on fire, and then they were seen by medical professionals, medical staff. However, they weren't seen for 2 days. So they were with burns all over their body for 2 days before they were able to see.
Before they got medical attention?
Yeah, before they were able to get medical attention. And yeah, it's just that the strain of so many people that are incarcerated in any given facility, because a lot of the times they're always short-staffed or people are working doubles or what have you. And I remember during pandemic times here locally and everywhere, really, it was a nightmare. Like, it was an absolute nightmare in terms of people having to do uprisings to get medical attention, of people, just not having access to PPE, of people dying behind the walls, So
when somebody's severely sick or even mildly sick, are they pretty good about giving them medical attention? Are they pretty prompt about that? Or do they kind of just shun them for a while until they feel like...
Sometimes they do that. But often I feel like they just don't have enough staff to do anything about it. Like usually there would be a skeleton crew of people at the facility I was at. I think it's not under the same corporation, the medical care corporation that they had. I'm not sure, but it was like a skeleton crew. And for someone to get seen, there'd be people that needed glasses. And it's like you go to visit for like a library delivery and then they're like, I need my medication. I don't have my glasses. I need laundry. Like they would have their big list and be like, oh, well, I'll try to call around and see. But there were so many people. Like there's no way that you can, or sometimes they'd write on their library requests, like I need to see a doctor or whatever. But yeah, a lot of the times the medical system is very strained, and that's just the way it is, Yeah,
I know my son, when he was in RDC, they had a horrible infestation of maggots.
Oh.
in their kitchen. And also, one of the inmates worked in the transport van where they transport the food, I guess from like a warehouse place somewhere by the RDC that they take back and forth. But there were also maggots in the van. And on top of that, there was leeches in the shower.
What the hell?
And then they had a backup problem where there was stuff coming up from the pipes in the shower and the sinks. One of the other moms, her son is in Las Cruces, and he told her that there was feces coming up in the kitchen sinks, and it was contaminating the tabletops, and the prison still told them to serve the food. So some family members from the outside called, I don't know if hazmat or who they called, but they went to check at the prison, and they shut them down. But to think that they still want to feed our people this food that has been contaminated is just, it's not right, you know? And I'm just never, you know, sometimes I'm mind blown, but I always think like, geez, I thought the last thing I heard was mind blowing. Like, this really takes the cake. But then when I think that, then something else worse happens, you know, that I hear, or that my son experienced, or one of the other moms in our moms group, you know, their kid experienced, you know. So I don't know. I don't know who helps, you know, who takes care of this kind of stuff? Who's going to stop this kind of treatment, you know? And I know that we're not going to stop. I know that we're not going to, you know, we're not going to fall back. We're going to keep pushing.
Yeah.
You know, because we stand for our people.
Yeah, and like decarceration, you know, I think is really important. Not relying heavily on the carceral system, because it is strained. Like, they're usually understaffed, or, you know, what have you. And do people really want to work in a situation where your job is to repress somebody so bad that you're withholding them from toilet paper, from menstrual products, from quality food? You're giving them food that's, you know, contaminated with feces. Like, a lot of the times the cells were flooded, you know, with feces. And I remember there was an elderly man who was in his cell, and it was flooded, and it was the middle of summer, so it was really hot. There was no air conditioning in there. It was like really hot in there. And what the COs had done was they cracked open his door, their metal doors, you know, and he was hyperventilating through the door, trying to breathe.
Oh my God.
And I'll never forget that. And people who work in those environments will never forget the inhumanity that they have brought. It's really not a good place for any of us, you know. We have to figure out other ways, decarcerating.
Yes.
Releasing our elders, not relying on the carceral system for our youth. I know that our state is hell-bent on passing tougher laws to criminalize our youth and put them away and throw away the key. But as I keep saying, root causes, you know. And I did want to read a quote.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is regarding conditions. Again, Red Onion State Prison. I keep bringing it up just because of, it's not an isolated case that the conditions are so bad that people are willing to take any way out. Self-harm was something I saw a lot when I was at the Penitentiary of New Mexico, and being somebody who has a history of self-harm myself, seeing somebody confined with no choice and no escape and no resources, like for me, it's like there's always been someone around who's been like, no, Courtney, it's okay. Like
Right.
there's always been the potential for resources. Being locked down, it's different. People don't have those resources. They're punished for it. They're locked down even more for it. They're written up for hurting themselves, But I just wanted to share a quote by Ekong Eshiet, as read during a community meeting at the Richmond-based Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality on December 7th, 2024. Me and several of my revolutionary brothers here at this warehouse self-immolated ourselves with Inferno as a desperate call for help. By tormenting myself in the flames, I was hoping that I would escape the torment that I suffered at the hands of these racists, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And as I mentioned, this isn't an isolated case where conditions are so bad that people feel like they have no way out. And I feel like our society is measured by the way we treat our most marginalized and vulnerable within it. And that says a lot.
And what prison is this, Courtney? Is it a federal or a state prison in?
It's Red Onion State Prison in Virginia. But
And what types of conditions are they experiencing there?
solitary confinement, racist abuse, and often people have to be, people who are incarcerated have, their Bibles or Qurans thrown to the floor, beatings, racial taunts, and often are naked and prone with their hands handcuffed behind them. And they don't have access to, water, clothing in the hole, and retribution, retribution. The corrections staff across the board are often responsible for acts of retribution against people, setting people up to get stabbed, killed, and so much is not in the light that needs to be brought to the light. Like, I want to see people who are lawmakers that hold themselves in such high regard to spend not just a minute or, a day or a night or an hour, but I want to see them spend a significant amount of time in these facilities.
Right.
Without warning where they go and clean it up, but I want to see them meaningfully see what it's like and care, and that's the thing is like, you have to care. If you're in a position of power, if you're in a position of political power and authority over others, and you represent the community, really represent us and give a damn, like at least show that you give a damn or act like you give a damn. And that's what we need to see,
I know we just got through, I know legislation is not over until next week, right?
Yes.
Let's just shift gears for a minute and go there. Did you see anything that was hopeful in legislation this year?
So one thing that I'm really setting my bets on in terms of legislation would be that I think and I hope will make it through is the Immigrant Safety Act, HB 9. And I feel like we just recently saw that there were that ICE detention or that ICE officers this week did 48 arrests, you know. So I'm hoping that we can see some progress on that. Also, the data privacy, SB 404, which is the Data Privacy Act, I feel like that is really important just to keep us safe and keep our information safe from, in terms of our health information and so forth. I feel like what we really need to focus on is making sure that less of us are criminalized and that less of us are involved in the criminal legal system. And I feel like those are some of the hopes that I have in terms of this upcoming this current legislative session.
Mm-hmm. I know you were really also fighting for the whole feminine, what was it? The feminine care for people behind the walls. Did that get passed?
So that is currently not moving.
Okay.
And yeah, it's currently not moving. The HB 250 to provide menstrual products to people
Yes.
who are incarcerated. A fiscal component was passed already. But I feel like, there's just a lot that is taking place with them trying to pass all these criminalization bills. And there's just so much legislation every 2 years that has to be considered that it hasn't moved. I don't know if it will, but I would hope that we can get it next time. Basic human hygiene, and a standard so that all facilities are practicing providing people with basic hygiene that they need when they're managing their menstrual cycle. Just the basic. It's just like toilet paper, and often, people don't have the best experience when trying to get what they need. So, this time around, it's not moving, and the session is almost over. But as far as, with SB 404, the healthcare privacy protections, we're seeing that there's a federal increase on restrictions on abortion and gender affirming care. And so protecting sensitive health data is really important. And I feel like it's important to, as we see also gender affirming care criminalized on the federal level and in various states, trans people being basically laws being made to exclude trans people from public life, and laws being made to prevent people from, bodily autonomy. Like, the stakes are high for all of us. So criminalization and carcerality and relying on the carceral system, like, you could be on the other side of that if the government decides that you're now criminalized for what you're doing, whether it be your expression or even your free speech or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't do any of us a service to bolster and want to see strengthened prison system and police that on the streets, the level of abuse is just unreal. Often, often people have a lot of run-ins with the police and it can be deadly, so.
Right. Going back to the feminine products, the reason I brought that up is because that's another like place of power that I feel. I know Lenore, who is also part of Millions for Prisoners, when she went to MDC, she had a horrifying experience with that, needing feminine products, and they told her, you have to wait, we don't have any right now. And then her going again and asking, like, hey, I really need I really need a maxi pad. Can you please, bring me one? They threw a roll of toilet paper at her and told her, make it last.
Wow.
So that right there is like another form of having power over people, right? Behind the walls. and which is sad to me. I mean, as far as like feminine products, like you want to use your power over that, you know? So.
And often people will make their own out of whatever's around. So bedding or clothing or pads. They'll make pads into tampons, and then the fibers get stuck and embedded in their reproductive tract, and then whatever health issues may arise. So,
and how sad is it, Courtney, that they even have to go that route, though?
No,
they should not. They should not have to be making like feminine products. They should not have to be doing that.
And there's something to be said about acknowledging someone's human dignity, you know, and how that translates into their recovery and healing and their journey outside of the system. And also, like, what does it do to you as an individual withholding somebody from basic human dignity that they need to manage their menstrual cycle? What does it do for you? It just harms you, you know, it makes you into a monster. And yeah, the way out of that, quit your job, you know. The Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee does not recognize COs to be as workers because they are traitors of the working class. They oppress the working class. They murder the working class. So, if you really care about the community and community safety, start working with us on other solutions. Like, drop the power trip, you know? It's not serving you.
Right. Restoration. Restoration and healing, you know? I want to talk a little bit about prisoner labor exploitation and the hidden corruption in work programs.
Oh, yeah. So, incarcerated labor is something that is used in the United States where people who are incarcerated, their labor can be exploited for pennies on the dollar of what people on the outside world earn. And conditions of labor can be really awful. They can get away with really awful working conditions. For example, during COVID, people were having to dig graves for people who were dying from COVID. And incarcerated people were digging the graves, you know, and being exposed to what at the time was a new epidemic that was, and it still is here, but it was a new epidemic that was spreading all over the United States. And so prisoners were placed at the front lines of that. They're placed at the front lines of doing a lot of labor for basically no pay. And they don't get credit for it when they leave a lot of the times. In some firefighting programs, I think they might
make $1 an hour.
Yeah, they might make a little bit more than a few
maybe
pennies,
3.
but yeah, and it was kind of like, it's not always an opportunity for everyone in situations where it's warehoused. So here in New Mexico, a lot of the facilities are warehousing. I know that there was a guy at the Supermax that had a job. But then the other people were mainly at like the level 2. I think there were some different porters that did different things, but the one that stands out most was the guy that his job was to mop up blood whenever
oh my God.
Yeah, a brutalization had happened. And I always wanted to just have him in the library so that he could explore the books because he was always walking around. But, you know, of course, not allowed. But yeah, it's very exploitative practices. Prisoners have gone on strike for working conditions on multiple occasions, and also brought to light through the there was a strike in 2024, December, that took place, where there were work stoppages throughout various facilities, to amplify the demands of the people behind the walls, and just to bring up the demands. So yeah, there was also a strike in August of 2018. Usually it happens in Black August to commemorate George Jackson. And it's a movement against, what is considered to be modern day slavery. So I'm just going to read the national demands of people in federal, immigration, and state prisons surrounding the prison strikes. One is the immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and prison policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. 2 is an immediate end to prison slavery. All persons imprisoned in any place of detention under the United States jurisdiction must be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. Number 3 is rescission of the Prison Litigation Reform Act, allowing imprisoned humans a proper channel to address grievances and violations of their rights. Number 4 is rescission of the Truth in Sentencing Act and the Sentencing Reform Act so that imprisoned humans have the possibility of rehabilitation and parole. No human shall be sentenced to death by incarceration or serve any sentence without the possibility of parole. Number 5 is an immediate end to the racial overcharging, oversentencing, and parole denials of Black and brown humans. Black humans shall no longer be denied parole because the victim of the crime was white, which is a particular problem in southern states. Number 6 is an immediate end to racist gang enhancement laws targeting Black and brown humans. Number 7 is no denial of access to rehabilitation programs for imprisoned humans at their place of detention because of their label as a violent offender. Number 8 is state prisons must be funded specifically to offer more rehabilitation services. Number 9 is reinstatement of Pell Grant eligibility to prisoners in all U.S. states and territories. And number 10 is a recognition of voting rights for all confined citizens serving prison sentences, pretrial detainees, and so-called ex-felons. Their votes must be counted, representation is demanded, and all voices count. So, it's basically a coalition of various organizations, people that are demanding a different circumstance for people that are behind the walls. And prison labor is very heavily exploited in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. In a perfect world, Courtney, what would you like to see instead of prison facilities? What would be the ideal thing for our people? An ideal facility for those who are being charged of a crime?
Mm-hmm. I think that the ideal world would include nourishing somebody like they're a seed that's going to develop into a tree that is necessary for life, I feel like nourishing people from the get-go, providing people with the resources that they need to survive, to thrive, to heal. And if somebody does harm another, trying to find healing and restoration with the person. Not lockdowns, not walls, not bars.
Right.
And if there is a reduction in our reliance on facilities to just warehouse people, and let's say that somebody does need to be kept away from the majority of society to go through healing, just something that's more humane and that allows people to be nourished and grow, and that they have access to nature and they have access to educational resources that help them to achieve their dreams, in
Right.
terms of their intellectual dreams and their and access to family and community, and enough people on the sidelines that are there to support that person, and of course the victim, because if somebody does harm, then there's a victim of harm. So supports that don't rely on vengeance and trying to make somebody else suffer.
Right.
Because even if suffering occurred, it causing suffering to the other person doesn't make it whole. It doesn't make it okay.
Right.
And yeah, just kind of growing up in the era that I did, there was a lot of street violence, among our people. And there's a lot of harm caused to each other. But what I'd like to see is a world where we don't need to rely on that, where we can just be seen and have what we need to live a good life, and be with our families and communities and, just keep making the world a better place.
My brother was in 1997, he actually went in in 1996. He went into the main prison facility in Santa Fe. And I remember my daughter was only 3 or 4 years old, and they had these outdoor picnics there at the facility. And we went to that, and they had little, different little stations set up. Like there was one little station where it was like you can draw with chalk on the sidewalk, and then they had another little art program here. And just being in that environment, not even one time did I think oh my God, I'm in a yard full of criminals, I'm freaked out. I never felt that, not one time. All I felt that day, being around all those men and the families that were there to support them, was love.
Yeah.
And unity, And I think that those are the types of things that you just mentioned about nurturing.
Yeah.
People need to be nurtured.
Yeah.
We all do.
And we have that in our hearts too, right? I remember one experience that will always resonate with me for the rest of my life was that at the level 5, there was kind of like a rec yard where the guys could go out and do laps or whatever. And it was less restrictive as at the level 6, so they can run around, do laps, whatever. And one of the people that was at yard was there's little baby bunnies. And of course, my background's with animals and stuff, so I ran over and saw that there was a corm of cottontail, babies, And usually with cottontails, they're in a very shallow little kind of hole that the mom digs, and she'll go find food and then come back. And just the level of concern that everyone felt in that moment. It was COs, it was, incarcerated people that were out in yard. Everyone was just dropped everything that they were thinking of or doing. And they were so concerned about those little baby bunnies. And I was just, my instinct was something like that is just to leave them alone because mom's going to come.
Right.
But something like that resonates so much more in such a sterile environment, because sometimes you'll see a bird on the barbed wire and it's the most beautiful thing that you can ever see because it's so sterile and free of any kind of emotion or art or creativity. Humans are so creative, right? And we have so much compassion at the same time. Somebody could have caused harm to another person, but at the same time they could have all the compassion in the world for baby bunny. Yeah, the tiny little thing. We have to acknowledge that somebody can't just be reduced to harm.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, folks don't even commit the harm. They're wrongfully accused, or there's always those instances. Yes. But if harm happens, somebody can't be reduced to just that harm.
Right. I now that you brought up the bunnies, I remember when my brother was in Santa Fe, Maine, there was lots of cats there. Lots of cats. And I remember we'd go visit, and there were just be tons of cats everywhere. And my brother said that they used to like feed them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And my friend, a good friend of mine who actually just kind of recently released like late last year. But his name is Ajamu Watu, and he's a new African, or he was a new African prisoner in California, CDCR, and he had a pet black widow that he cared for, and he was like, when I leave, I'm gonna have to give my pet black widow away to one of the comrades. And they had set up a system of mutual aid so that they had stuff that, you know, food or supplies or things that other guys needed when they got in, that they would just have a box, and then whoever needed would take, whoever, and then they would contribute, you know, like any extra that they had. So it's that, like, there is caring. You can't just put someone in a box and pretend they're not a human being anymore. Just have a little bit of compassion, you know, because there's compassion in there too.
Right. Well, I think we touched on a lot tonight, Courtney, and, you know, you and I both, along with our comrades, have such a huge heart for our people behind the walls. And I just want to thank you for sitting here tonight and sharing your experiences, sharing, you know, your time that you spent working behind the walls and the things that you experienced and saw. And before we close tonight, I just want to ask if you can just share with our listeners a little bit about Millions for Prisoners and what we do.
Yeah. So Millions for Prisoners is like a family to me. And the work that we do is very much embedded by the criminal legal system, when often the criminal legal system is really easy to navigate for resourced individuals, but a lot of people who are impacted by incarceration and the policing system and police violence and state sanctioned violence are often not resourced people, you know, families struggle. And so we show up with them in any way that we can, whether it be to help them with, you know, showing up for their court dates, you know, to be there in community with them in solidarity and as a continuation of their family. We do a lot of work surrounding families and restoration and trying to get families back together. We do cop watch, you know, observing how the police interact with our communities, because it often is very violent. There's a lot of violence on our streets that is being brought on by state repression in New Mexico. It's very bad. It's the most reformed police department. The APD is the most reformed police department in the country and has the highest rate of murders. We help to advocate for better conditions. We work at the legislature, you know, we're up in the legislature. Most recently, our attempt to end solitary confinement with HB 533, and then HJR 10 and HJR 15 to end felony disenfranchisement and allow people the right to vote, as well as HJR 15, which was to end the slavery exception in our state. We do advocacy around, we do mutual aid, advocating for and with and in solidarity with people who are experiencing criminalization because they are unhoused. We work on the national level at raising issues that are taking place inside of prisons and jails throughout the United States.
And we stand with our
Yeah,
people.
and we stand with our people who are behind the walls.
Yes.
All of us that are part of the group are impacted in some way. Some of us, it is more intimate because, for some of our folks, such as yourself, you have a son. We have folks that also organize with us from behind the walls. Some of our members are jailhouse lawyers and litigate so that they can get progress on their cases. We do a little bit of everything, and we also work in coalition with mutual aid. We are Albuquerque Mutual Aid, so yeah, we're here to not just for narrative shift, but also to build the world that we want to live in.
Right.
And we're powerful.
Yes, very, very. So with that all said, I just want to say that if there's anybody out there that, is going through the process of your son, your daughter, your grandson, your neighbor, whatever it may be, and you're needing guidance and support, you can find us on Facebook. It's Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, and we're here to support you, and we will definitely guide you and help you emotionally through the process, like Courtney said, through the court system, through any questions you have regarding the legal system, because I know that can be complicated at times. I know I had a really hard time navigating through that when Josiah was going through all his court hearings and stuff, just all the information. You're trying to deal with the fact that your loved one is incarcerated. So I wasn't even really, I had to go back and ask my daughter at times, like, wait, what happened? And when did that happen? And when did they say that? Because I don't remember that, because I was so consumed with the emotion of my son being incarcerated. So I'm so grateful for Millions for Prisoners, because I met, like I've said in the past, I've met Celinda and Clifton when my son was out in the street, and they have been giving me guidance ever since, and that was 5 years ago. And here I am today, and I'm so grateful to be a part of Millions for Prisoners, and we're a strong community, and we're here for everybody.
Yes, and every one of us brings a universe of resources and just so much to learn, and to have a shoulder to cry on, to mourn with, like, I am so grateful that you joined our team.
Thank
personally.
you, Courtney. I feel blessed to be a part of it. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.